Beth's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the key in the front door. The cool brass felt solid beneath her touch, grounding her in the reality of the moment. Beside her, Angela stood quietly, her small hand wrapped tightly around Beth's own, a mix of apprehension and quiet wonder written across her delicate features. This was the beginning of something new, a fresh chapter neither of them fully understood yet. "Welcome home, sweetheart," Beth said softly, nudging the door open with her shoulder. The warm scent of vanilla and freshly polished wood greeted them as they stepped inside. The living room stretched out before Angela, cozy and inviting, with a deep blue couch positioned beneath a wide bay window and cream-colored walls adorned with framed family photos. Her dark eyes widened as she took it all in, her grip on Beth's hand loosening ever so slightly as curiosity fought against her natural shyness. At the foot of the stairs, Tom hoisted Angela's small purple suitcase, the one she'd clung to at the adoption center, up onto his shoulder. "Let's show you your room first," Beth suggested, giving Angela an encouraging smile. The three of them ascended the stairs together, Angela's tiny fingers brushing along the wooden banister as they went. Beth's heart swelled watching her take in every detail, knowing how much love and care had been poured into making this house feel like home for their new daughter. When they reached the bedroom, Beth pushed open the door to reveal a space bathed in warm yellow hues. The walls, painted a soft, cheerful shade of sunlight, were lined with bookshelves filled with colorful picture books, their spines neatly arranged in inviting rows. A plush pink comforter lay spread across the twin bed, and in the corner, a small wooden rocking chair sat waiting. Angela hesitated on the threshold, her gaze darting from one element of the room to another, taking it all in with careful observation. Then, slowly, she took a tentative step inside, her fingers trailing over the soft bedding before landing on a stuffed rabbit nestled against the pillows. "That's yours," Beth said gently, watching as Angela's small fingers traced the rabbit's floppy ears. "You can name her anything you want." Angela looked up at Beth, eyes wide and searching. Then, in the softest whisper, she said, "Bunny." Beth let out a breathless laugh, warmth blooming in her chest. "Bunny it is." That first week passed in a blur of small discoveries and new routines. Beth marveled at how quickly Angela picked up English words, her voice growing more confident each day. At bedtime, she would point at objects, her pronunciation careful and deliberate. "Book," Angela would say softly, touching the cover of a storybook. "That's right," Beth would encourage, her heart swelling with pride. She'd pull another book from the shelf, eager to nurture this hunger for learning. During the day, Tom found himself unexpectedly looking forward to lunch breaks. He worked from home most days, and while he was accustomed to solitude in his home office, Angela had quickly become a quiet but welcome presence in his routine. She would sit at the kitchen table, carefully tracing letters in a notebook while he made sandwiches. "Sandwich," she'd repeat after him, her small lips forming the word precisely. "That's right," he'd respond, offering her an approving smile. Bath time became a cherished ritual, with Angela giggling at the bubbles Beth prepared for her each evening. "Duck," she'd say, pointing to the yellow rubber toy bobbing in the water. "Water, splash." Even family dinners took on a new warmth. Though Angela ate quietly, she absorbed the atmosphere with wide, attentive eyes, her expressions softening as she became more accustomed to the rhythms of their home. Each night, their bedtime routine became a sacred moment of closeness. Beth would sit at the edge of Angela's bed, a storybook open in her lap, while Tom leaned against the doorway, his gaze tender as he watched his wife and daughter share this quiet moment. Angela would snuggle under her pink comforter, pointing at pictures and whispering words she had learned that day. One night, she traced a tiny finger over an illustration of a mother, father, and child holding hands beneath a bright blue sky. "Family," she murmured. Beth's throat tightened with emotion. "That's right, sweetheart," she whispered. "We're your family now." Tom stepped forward, tucking Angela's blanket more securely around her small frame. Angela blinked up at him, her expression unreadable for a long moment before she simply whispered, Good night." Beth and Tom shared a glance, their hearts full. They watched as Angela's eyes fluttered shut, her breathing slow and steady, the glow of her butterfly-shaped nightlight casting gentle shadows on the walls. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm. But then, one evening, everything changed. The kitchen was warm and filled with the comforting scents of cinnamon and freshly brewed tea. Beth and Tom sat at the table after finishing dinner, the last remnants of their meal pushed aside as they lingered in quiet conversation. "I can't believe how fast she's learning," Beth said, rinsing a plate before placing it into the dishwasher. "It feels like just yesterday she was barely speaking at all." Tom nodded, drying his hands on a dish towel. "She's thriving here. Did you see the way she beamed when she read that entire page by herself today?" Beth smiled, but something in the back of her mind tugged at her. "She does seem more at ease, but—" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Lately, I've noticed something odd." Tom frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "She's been talking in her sleep." Beth glanced toward the stairs, as if listening for any sign of movement. Not just murmuring, but actual words. And last night, she swallowed. She said a name. Tom's posture stiffened. "A name?" Beth nodded. "Jason." Silence hung between them for a moment. "Could be an imaginary friend?" Tom suggested, though his tone held a note of uncertainty. "Maybe," Beth conceded. "But the way she said it, Tom, it wasn't just a name. It was longing, like she was searching for someone." Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Could it be someone from the orphanage?" "That's what I thought," Beth admitted, but her records never mentioned anyone by that name. They fell into thoughtful silence, the only sound in the house the ticking of the kitchen clock. "I think we need to pay the orphanage a visit," Tom said finally, his voice firm. "Just to be sure." Beth met his gaze, worry flickering in her eyes. "First thing tomorrow," she agreed. Neither of them realized it yet, but by seeking answers, they were about to uncover something far bigger than they ever expected. The autumn wind whispered through the trees as Beth and Tom pulled into the orphanage's parking lot the next morning. The sky hung low and gray, threatening rain, and a few stray leaves tumbled across the pavement. Beth tightened her coat around her as she stepped out of the car, a slight shiver running down her spine. Maybe it was just the chill in the air, or maybe it was something else, an unease settling in her chest that she couldn't quite shake. Tom walked around the car, his steady presence grounding her as he placed a warm hand on her back. "Ready?" he asked. Beth nodded, drawing a breath to steady herself. "Let's get some answers." They walked hand in hand through the heavy wooden doors, the familiar scent of industrial cleaner and worn carpet greeting them. The memories of the day they had first met Angela resurfaced instantly, her small, uncertain eyes peeking up at them, the way she had clutched Beth's hand as if afraid to let go. They had walked this very hallway with hope in their hearts, ready to give a child a home. Now, as they approached the front desk, that same hope was laced with unease. A middle-aged woman with graying hair sat behind the desk, her glasses perched low on her nose as she reviewed a stack of paperwork. She looked up at their approach, offering a polite but distant smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Hartley," she greeted them. "What brings you back? Is everything all right with Angela?" Beth returned the smile, though hers felt forced. "Angela is doing wonderfully," she assured her. "But we have some questions about her past. Specifically, about someone named Jason." The woman's smile faltered ever so slightly. She glanced at Tom, then back at Beth. "Jason?" she echoed, her voice carefully neutral. Beth nodded. "Angela has been mentioning his name in her sleep. She speaks about him like he was important to her. We were hoping to check her records again, just to be thorough." For a moment, the woman hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edges of the paperwork in front of her. Then, after what felt like too long a pause, She cleared her throat and forced a reassuring smile. "I don't recall any mention of a Jason in Angela's file," she said smoothly, "but I can double-check for you." Beth and Tom exchanged a quick glance as the woman rose from her chair and disappeared down the hall. Beth's heart pounded in her chest. Something felt off. Minutes ticked by, and when the woman finally returned, she held Angela's file in her hands. She opened it, flipping through the pages before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing here about a Jason. No siblings or close friends listed." She shut the file with finality, placing it back on the desk. Beth's stomach twisted. "Are you sure?" She pressed gently. "Angela speaks about him like he was very real to her." The woman offered a tight smile, her expression unreadable. "Children in orphanages often create imaginary companions. It's a way to cope with loneliness." Tom's jaw tightened. "And you're certain there's no record of him at all?" "I'm certain," she said, her tone firmer this time. "If he existed, he would be in her file. I'm sorry, but I can't help you." Beth studied the woman's face. There was something about the way she spoke, the way she avoided their eyes, that sent a ripple of suspicion through her. "Thank you for your time," Tom said, his voice even. But Beth could hear the edge beneath it, the unspoken realization that they weren't getting the full truth. As they stepped outside, Beth let out a slow breath, trying to process what had just happened. The wind had picked up, rustling the bare branches above them. "That was a lie," she murmured. Tom nodded, jaw tight. She knew something. That much was obvious. Beth bit her lip, her thoughts racing. "I don't understand. If Jason was just another child at the orphanage, why hide it? Why not just tell us the truth?" Tom exhaled sharply, glancing back at the building as if the answers were hidden somewhere behind those old walls. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think we need to find someone who can." That evening, after Angela was safely tucked into bed, Beth and Tom sat at the kitchen table, their untouched cups of tea growing cold between them. The quiet hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. "We need help," Tom finally said. "Someone who knows how to dig deeper than we can." Beth looked up at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. A private investigator. The very next day, they found themselves seated in the small but tidy office of Daniel Evans, a seasoned investigator in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He listened intently as Beth and Tom explained everything, Angela's murmured words in her sleep, the strange reaction at the orphanage, the dead end in the records. When Beth finished speaking, Daniel set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "That's certainly suspicious," he said, folding his hands together. "Children that age don't typically invent detailed memories out of nowhere. If Angela remembers Jason, chances are he was real." Beth felt a weight lift off her chest at his words. "That's what we think, too." Daniel nodded. "I'll start with the official records, see if there's any mention of a Jason connected to the orphanage. If they covered something up, it won't be in plain sight. But I have my ways." Over the next few days, Daniel buried himself in the investigation. His office lights glowed late into the night as he scoured databases, sifted through adoption records, and cross-referenced documents. Bit by bit, a pattern began to emerge, one that sent a chill down his spine. On the fourth day, he found it. Beneath layers of bureaucracy and carefully altered paperwork, Daniel uncovered a hidden connection between Angela and another child, a boy named Jason. The two had entered the orphanage together, but their files had been deliberately separated, their familial ties erased. And worse, Daniel discovered a troubling pattern in the adoption records. Single-child adoptions carried significantly higher fees than sibling adoptions. Mr. Curtis, the orphanage director, had orchestrated multiple sibling separations over the years, fabricating records to increase profits. Angela and Jason were just one case among many. With the evidence in hand, Daniel picked up his phone and dialed Beth's number. The line clicked after 2 rings. "Beth, this is Daniel Evans. I have something you need to hear." Beth's voice was cautious. "Did you find anything?" "Yes." Daniel said, his voice grave. Angela does have a brother. His name is Jason, and the orphanage deliberately separated them. Silence hung on the other end before Beth finally breathed. Oh my God. Tom's voice joined hers, thick with barely restrained anger. They split them up for money? Daniel sighed. That's what the records suggest. Beth felt something inside her twist, a mix of heartbreak and fury. Jason, where is he now? Daniel flipped through his notes. He was adopted last year by a family named Hughes. They live about 40 minutes from you in a town called Millbrook. Beth gripped Tom's hand as she processed the information. Jason was out there. Angela's brother was out there. And now, they had to find him. Beth sat frozen in place, the phone still pressed against her ear, her heart hammering against her ribs. Jason was real. Angela hadn't imagined him. He wasn't some figment of her past, distorted by time and longing. He existed, and he had been torn away from her. Beth's throat felt tight as she swallowed hard, trying to push past the lump of emotion lodged there. Tom's grip on her hand tightened. What do we do now? His voice was calm, but Beth could hear the undercurrent of restrained anger beneath it. Daniel's voice came steady through the receiver. I was able to track down the Hughes family's contact information. They adopted Jason about a year ago, around the same time you took Angela home. From what I've gathered, they seem like good people, unaware of the deception behind their adoption process. Beth exhaled shakily. They don't know he has a sister. No, Daniel confirmed. They were told he had no family, just like you were told Angela had no one. Beth felt the injustice of it all crash over her like a wave, the weight of it nearly suffocating. These weren't just mistakes. This wasn't simple bureaucratic incompetence. This was deliberate, calculated cruelty. A man had looked at two helpless children, had known they belonged together, and had chosen to tear them apart for money. We have to tell them, Beth said, her voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotion inside her. They deserve to know. I agree, Daniel said. That's why I suggest you reach out to them carefully. A phone call might be best. Give them space to process before deciding how to move forward. Tom nodded, already reaching for his laptop. Do you have their number? Daniel read it off, and Beth scribbled it down on a notepad with shaking hands. When they ended the call, she and Tom just sat there in silence, staring at the phone between them. This is going to change everything, Beth murmured. Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his jaw. I know. After a long moment, Beth picked up the phone and dialed the number Daniel had given them. The call rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. Hello? The voice was warm, friendly, unsuspecting. Beth cleared her throat, gripping Tom's hand for support. Mrs. Hughes? My name is Beth Hartley. I know this might seem strange, but I have something important to discuss with you. It's about your son, Jason. There was a pause on the other end. Beth could hear rustling, the sound of movement, as if the woman had sat up straighter. Is everything okay? Yes. Beth rushed to reassure her. Jason is fine. This isn't about his health or safety. It's about his past. My husband and I adopted a little girl last year. Her name is Angela. Silence. Beth hesitated, then pressed on. We've recently uncovered some information that suggests Jason and Angela are siblings. A sharp intake of breath. What? Mrs. Hughes's voice came out faint, stunned. Beth felt her own breath catch. We have documents, proof that they were in the orphanage together, but their records were deliberately separated. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. We think the orphanage director kept them apart for financial gain. Mrs. Hughes still didn't speak, and for a moment Beth worried she might have hung up. But then, finally, she heard a shaky exhale. That can't be, Mrs. Hughes murmured, almost to herself. We were told Jason had no family. We asked. Beth closed her eyes, pain tightening her chest. So did we. There was another pause, then a muffled voice. Mr. Hughes must have entered the room. Beth could hear his wife explaining in hurried whispers, her voice laced with shock and disbelief. Then, after a few more moments, she came back on the line. I don't even know what to say, Mrs. Hughes admitted. Jason talks about a girl sometimes. We assumed she was a friend from the orphanage. He draws pictures of her, always the same little girl with dark hair. But he never mentioned a sister. I don't think he even knows. Beth's heart ached at the thought. Jason had been too young to remember, too young to understand what had been taken from him. We don't want to pressure you into anything, Tom said, finally speaking. But we think they deserve to know, to see each other again. Mrs. Hughes inhaled deeply, clearly trying to gather herself. Yes, she finally said. I think we need to meet. They settled on a neutral location, a park halfway between their towns. The meeting would take place that weekend, giving both families time to prepare. When Beth ended the call, she set the phone down and stared at it for a long moment. They said yes, she whispered. Tom let out a slow breath. Then we're doing this. The next 2 days passed in a blur of emotions. Beth and Tom debated how to tell Angela, whether to wait until they were at the park or prepare her beforehand. In the end, they decided honesty was best. The night before the meeting, Beth sat on the edge of Angela's bed as she always did, running her fingers through the little girl's dark curls. Angela clutched Bunny to her chest, her sleepy eyes blinking up at Beth. "Sweetheart," Beth said softly, "there's something I want to tell you." Angela rubbed her eyes. "What?" Beth hesitated, then gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind Angela's ear. "You know how you talk about Jason sometimes?" Angela's small hands tightened around her stuffed rabbit. "Yes." Beth's throat felt thick. "Jason is real, sweetheart. He's not just in your dreams. He's your brother." Angela's eyes widened. "Brother?" Beth nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "And tomorrow we're going to see him." Angela stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, her lips parted in a tiny gasp. "Jason?" she repeated, as if making sure she'd heard right. Beth smiled, though her eyes burned with emotion. "Yes, baby. Jason." Angela's face was unreadable for a moment, as if her little mind was struggling to wrap itself around the revelation. Then, without another word, she threw herself into Beth's arms, holding on tighter than she ever had before. Beth rocked her gently, closing her eyes. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, she held onto the hope that everything they were doing was leading to something right, something that should never have been taken from them in the first place. The next day, they arrived at the park early. The air was crisp, the autumn leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Beth and Tom sat on a bench, Angela perched between them, her small hands clutched together in her lap. Then, across the field, another family approached. A woman and man walked side by side, their hands resting on the shoulders of a little boy with dark hair. He looked about Angela's age, his steps cautious, his gaze flickering around uncertainly. Beth heard Angela inhale sharply. Then, in a whisper, she said, "Jason." The little boy looked up, his eyes locked onto Angela's. For a moment, the world stood still. And then, with a burst of movement, Angela slid off the bench and ran toward him. Jason hesitated for only a second before doing the same. And as they collided in a fierce embrace, clinging to each other as if making up for every lost moment, Beth knew, without a doubt, that they had done the right thing. Sarah hesitated in the doorway, gripping the frame as an uneasy weight settled in her chest. Jason had never been this quiet before. He had always been a lively, curious child, full of energy and imagination. But ever since the meeting at the park, he had been different. Distracted, withdrawn, always staring out the window as if expecting something or someone to appear. Sarah stepped into the room, sitting down on the edge of his bed. She reached out, smoothing a hand over Jason's dark hair. "Sweetheart," she said gently. "I know you miss Angela." Jason finally turned to look at her, his big brown eyes filled with something Sarah could only describe as longing. "She's my sister, right?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah felt her throat tighten. How could she explain something so complicated to a child so young? She reached for his small hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Yes, sweetheart. She is." Jason's face scrunched in confusion. "Then why can't we live together?" Sarah's breath caught in her chest. She had spent the past few days convincing herself that keeping Jason was the right thing to do. He was their son, legally, emotionally. But when he asked that question, so innocent, so pure, she realized how deeply he had already bonded with Angela. She forced a smile, tucking a stray lock of hair behind his ear. "Families come in all shapes and sizes, Jason," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Just because you and Angela don't live together doesn't mean you aren't family." Jason frowned, clearly unsatisfied with that answer. He looked back out the window, his little fingers pressing against the glass. "I want to see her," he said softly. "Please, Mom." Sarah's heart twisted. She hated seeing him this way. He was usually so bright, so full of joy. And now, because of a decision she and John had made, he looked lost. She hesitated, glancing toward the hallway, knowing John wouldn't approve of this conversation. He had been firm in his decision. Jason was their son, and the matter was closed. But seeing the sadness in Jason's eyes made Sarah wonder if they had made the right choice. "I'll talk to Daddy, okay?" she finally said, brushing a gentle kiss against his forehead. "We'll figure something out." Jason nodded, but he didn't look convinced. Sarah stayed with him a little while longer, watching as he eventually curled up on his bed, hugging his stuffed bear tightly. As she left his room and closed the door behind her, she let out a long, shaky breath. Downstairs, John sat at the kitchen table, a pile of legal documents spread out in front of him. He looked up when Sarah entered, his expression immediately wary. "What's wrong?" Sarah crossed her arms, leaning against the doorway. "Jason's been asking about Angela." John exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temples. "I figured he would. He wants to see her." Sarah's voice was quiet, but there was a firmness in it that John recognized. John shook his head. "Sarah, we already made our decision." She stepped forward, lowering her voice. "But was it the right one?" John's jaw tightened. "He's our son." "I know that," Sarah said, frustration creeping into her tone. "But he's also her brother. You saw them together, John. It's not just some passing friendship. They're bonded, and keeping them apart. It's hurting him." John leaned back in his chair, staring at the documents in front of him. "We can't just change everything because he misses a girl he barely remembers." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "It's not just a girl. It's his sister." John rubbed his face, sighing. "We have to think about what's best for him." "That's exactly what I'm thinking about," Sarah shot back. "And right now, I don't think we're doing what's best." John was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he muttered, "What are you suggesting?" Sarah took a breath. "We let them see each other, regularly. Playdates, weekends, whatever it takes. And if it turns out that they need more than that, we reconsider everything." John's expression darkened. "You're talking about giving him up." Sarah hesitated, then shook her head. "I'm talking about doing what's right." John didn't respond immediately. He just stared at her, his jaw tight, his fingers drumming against the table. Finally, he exhaled sharply and looked away. "I need to think," he muttered. Sarah nodded, knowing that was the best she was going to get for now. Meanwhile, across town, Beth sat in Angela's bedroom, watching as the little girl carefully arranged her stuffed animals in a neat row along the bed. "Bunny goes here," Angela murmured to herself, placing the well-worn rabbit in the center. Beth smiled softly. "You're making sure Bunny is comfortable?" Angela nodded, then looked up. When can I see Jason again? Beth's heart clenched. I don't know yet, sweetheart. We're trying to work that out. Angela's small hands fidgeted with Bunny's ears. He's my brother, she whispered. I don't want to wait too long. Beth reached out, brushing a curl from Angela's forehead. I know, baby. I know. That night, Beth and Tom lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. Do you think they'll change their minds? Beth whispered. Tom sighed. I don't know. John's stubborn. Beth rolled onto her side, looking at her husband in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. If they don't, what do we do? Tom turned his head, meeting her gaze. We fight. Beth nodded, a quiet determination settling over her. They had come too far to stop now. The next morning, Beth's phone buzzed with an incoming call. She sat up in bed, rubbing sleep from her eyes before answering. Hello? Beth. Sarah's voice came through the line, hesitant but steady. John and I talked. We want to meet again. Beth's pulse quickened. When? Tomorrow. A pause. We're ready to listen. Beth exhaled, relief washing over her. Thank you, Sarah, truly. They arranged to meet at the same park. When Beth and Tom arrived with Angela the next afternoon, the Hughes family was already there. This time, when Jason saw Angela, he didn't hesitate. He ran straight into her arms, hugging her tightly. Beth watched the scene unfold, her throat tightening with emotion. Sarah stepped forward, exchanging a look with John before turning to Beth and Tom. We've been thinking a lot, she said carefully. And maybe we were wrong. John sighed, crossing his arms. We still don't know what the right decision is, he admitted. But we do know one thing, we can't keep them apart. Beth felt a surge of hope. Then let's figure it out together. John nodded slowly, one step at a time. Angela and Jason stood together, hands clasped, as if they had never been separated at all. And for the first time in a long while, Beth felt like everything might just work out after all. The breeze rolled through the park, rustling the golden leaves that littered the ground. Angela and Jason sat together under the jungle gym, their heads close, whispering to each other in a language only siblings could understand. Beth watched them from a nearby bench, her fingers laced tightly in her lap. Tom sat beside her, his eyes fixed on John, who stood a few feet away with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Sarah sat between them, visibly torn between relief and uncertainty. We've been struggling with this decision, Sarah admitted, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her jeans. Jason is our son. We love him and we've raised him for over a year now. But seeing how happy he is with Angela. She trailed off, glancing toward the children, her face softening. Beth leaned forward slightly. We aren't trying to take him away from you, she said gently. We just want what's best for both of them. And I think, deep down, you know they belong together. John exhaled sharply. It's not that simple. Tom's voice was calm but firm. It should be. John rubbed his temple, frustration evident. You're asking us to upend everything, to make a life-altering decision. Jason has a home with us, a stable life. Moving him could be traumatic. Beth glanced at Jason, watching as he giggled at something Angela whispered in his ear. And keeping them apart isn't? John flinched at that. Sarah hesitated, then spoke. We don't want to hurt him, but we need to be absolutely sure that whatever decision we make is the right one. We're open to more visits, to letting them grow closer naturally, but legally Jason is our child, and we're not prepared to change that yet. Beth nodded slowly, understanding but still feeling that lingering ache in her chest. Then let's keep meeting, she said. Let them build that connection, and maybe over time we'll all figure out what's best together. John still looked unconvinced, but Sarah nodded. That's fair. Angela ran up just then, her small hand wrapped tightly around Jason's. She looked up at Beth with bright, hopeful eyes. Can Jason come to our house? Beth's heart squeezed. She looked at Sarah and John, trying to gauge their reaction. Sarah looked uncertain, but John was already shaking his head. "I don't think that's a good idea right now," he said carefully. Angela's smile faded, and Beth saw the hurt in her daughter's eyes before she turned to Jason, squeezing his hand as if she were afraid he'd disappear. Sarah glanced at her husband, then at Beth, and something seemed to shift in her expression. She let out a small breath and turned to Angela. "How about this? Maybe we can set up a play date soon. Somewhere fun. Would you like that?" Angela looked at Jason for confirmation. When he nodded, she turned back to Sarah and nodded eagerly. Beth forced a smile, though she felt a pang of disappointment. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was a start. A few days later, Beth sat at the kitchen table staring at her phone. The meetings at the park had been going well. Angela and Jason were growing closer with each visit. But Beth knew time was passing, and the uncertainty of their future weighed on her. Tom entered the room, setting his coffee cup down beside her. "You've been quiet all morning." Beth sighed. "I just keep thinking, what if they never agree to let Jason come live with us? What if they keep dragging this out until the kids are older and the bond fades?" Tom leaned against the table, crossing his arms. "Then we fight harder." Beth looked up at him. "How?" Tom hesitated, then glanced toward the stack of papers on the counter. The legal documents Daniel had gathered, the adoption files, the evidence of Mr. Curtis's deception. Beth followed his gaze, realization dawning in her eyes. "You think we should take legal action?" Tom exhaled. "I think we need to be prepared. If they refuse to even consider what's best for Jason, if they're making decisions based on money rather than love, then we might not have a choice." Beth nodded slowly. "Then we talked to Patricia." That afternoon, they met again with Patricia Reese in her office. The lawyer listened carefully as they laid out the most recent developments. "I was hoping the Hughes family would come around on their own," Beth admitted. "But now I'm not so sure." Patricia tapped her pen against her legal pad, considering. "We can build a case," she said, "but it won't be easy. They've had legal custody of Jason for over a year. The court favors stability." "But what about the inheritance?" Tom asked. "Wouldn't that raise suspicion?" Patricia pursed her lips. "It could. If we can prove they're prioritizing financial gain over Jason's well-being, that would be a strong argument in court." Beth's stomach twisted. "I don't want to tear them apart. I just want what's right for the kids." Patricia nodded. "Then we start gathering more evidence. We document everything. And if they don't come around, we fight." The next time Beth and Tom met with Sarah and John, they approached the subject carefully. "We want to talk about Jason's future," Tom said. John stiffened immediately. "We've already told you our decision." Beth kept her voice calm. "And we've respected that. But we need to be honest. This situation isn't sustainable. The kids are getting closer every day. If we don't make a plan now, it'll be harder on them later." Sarah looked conflicted, but John's expression hardened. "We've made up our minds." Tom leaned forward slightly. "Are you sure this is about Jason, or is this about the money?" John's jaw tightened. "Excuse me?" Beth saw Sarah's expression flicker with unease. "We know about the inheritance," Beth said gently but firmly. "And I understand why that complicates things. But Jason and Angela deserve to be together. This isn't about who gets what." John's face darkened and he stood abruptly. "I think we're done here." Sarah looked between her husband and Beth, her face pale. But in the end, she didn't speak. Beth felt her heart sink as she watched them walk away. That night, she sat awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. "We lost them," she whispered. Tom turned onto his side, facing her. "Not yet." The next morning, Beth got a call from Daniel. "I found something," he said. Beth sat up, gripping the phone. "What?" Daniel took a slow breath. "Financial records. It looks like John Hughes has been making some questionable withdrawals from Jason's trust." Beth's blood ran cold. What? He's been using the money, Daniel confirmed. Not for Jason. At least, not entirely. If we bring this to court, it could change everything. Beth swallowed hard. Does Sarah know? I don't think so. Beth sat in stunned silence. Beth, Daniel said, his voice softer now, if you want to fight for Jason, this might be your best chance. Beth closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She had hoped they wouldn't have to go this far, but John had left them no choice. I'll call Patricia, she said, her voice steady. This wasn't just about keeping the siblings together anymore. This was about justice. And Beth wasn't going to stop until she got it. Beth stared at her phone long after the call ended, her fingers gripping it tightly as her mind raced. The idea that John had been using Jason's inheritance for his own purposes made her stomach churn. She had suspected his reluctance wasn't just about keeping Jason, but seeing it confirmed made her feel sick. Across the room, Tom was watching her carefully, already knowing from her expression that something was wrong. What did Daniel say? Tom asked, setting down his coffee cup. Beth exhaled shakily. John's been taking money from Jason's trust fund. Tom's face darkened instantly. Are you sure? Beth nodded. Daniel found records, withdrawals that don't match any expenses for Jason. This changes everything, Tom. Tom ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. That means John's been lying to everyone, including Sarah. Beth swallowed hard. I don't think she knows, but if she does, if she's complicit... She let the thought hang between them, dreading what it could mean. Tom's eyes flicked toward the stack of legal documents on the counter. Then we don't just have an emotional case anymore. We have a legal one. Beth nodded, her resolve hardening. We need to tell Patricia, and we need to figure out how to tell Sarah. If she's unaware of what John's doing, she deserves to know. The next morning, Beth and Tom sat in Patricia Reese's office, the heavy tension between them palpable. Patricia listened intently as Beth explained what Daniel had discovered, her experienced hands flipping through the financial documents he had sent over. The lawyer's normally composed expression darkened as she reviewed the details. This is serious, Patricia said, her voice carrying an edge of controlled anger. These withdrawals aren't small. They've been happening regularly. If John has been misusing Jason's inheritance, that's financial misconduct. Depending on how the funds were meant to be managed, he could be facing criminal charges. Beth's breath caught. Criminal? Patricia nodded. If he accessed Jason's trust in bad faith, that's theft. A court would take this very seriously, especially since the money belongs to a minor. Tom leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. So what are our options? Patricia took a deep breath. We have enough evidence to challenge their custody of Jason, but this is delicate. If we go in too aggressively, they could try to block us from seeing him altogether while the legal battle plays out. The best approach is to bring this to Sarah first. If she's unaware, she might be willing to cooperate. Beth's stomach churned at the thought. And if she knows? Patricia hesitated. Then we go to court immediately. Beth nodded, gripping Tom's hand tightly as they stood to leave. They had their answer. Now they just had to confront Sarah with the truth. Later that evening, Beth sat in the passenger seat as Tom drove toward the Hughes house. The normally short drive felt like it stretched forever, her nerves making every mile seem longer. The houses in their neighborhood were quiet, the autumn dusk settling in with the scent of burning wood from distant fireplaces. Beth's fingers twisted in her lap, her mind playing out every possible way the conversation could go. When they pulled into the driveway, Sarah was already outside, sitting on the porch steps with a cup of tea. Her expression flickered with surprise when she saw them, but she stood quickly, brushing her hair behind her ear. Beth? Tom? What's going on? Beth hesitated only for a second before stepping forward. Can we talk inside? Sarah's brow furrowed, but she nodded, leading them into the house. Jason's laughter echoed faintly from the backyard, and Beth's chest tightened at the sound. Sarah gestured toward the living room where the three of them sat down. Beth took a breath, choosing her words carefully. "Sarah, we found something, and we need you to hear us out." Sarah's expression grew wary, but she nodded. Beth glanced at Tom before continuing. "John has been withdrawing money from Jason's trust fund." The color drained from Sarah's face. "What?" Beth pulled out the documents Patricia had prepared and handed them to Sarah. "Daniel found the records. Money's been coming out in amounts that don't match any legitimate expenses for Jason. We don't know exactly where it's going, but it's clear John has been using it for something else." Sarah's hands trembled as she scanned the pages. Beth watched her carefully, hoping to see shock, anger, anything that would indicate she hadn't known. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." Beth let out a slow breath, relief washing over her. "Sarah, I know this is a lot, but you need to understand. This is illegal. If he's using that money for himself, he's stealing from Jason." Sarah's lips parted slightly, her breath uneven. I need to talk to him." Beth reached out, touching Sarah's hand gently. "I know you love Jason, and I know you want to do what's right for him. But if John is making choices that put Jason's future at risk, you need to act before it's too late." Sarah swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the documents. "I need to hear it from him." Beth nodded. "Will you call us after?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I will." Beth and Tom left, feeling the heavy weight of uncertainty settling over them. Would Sarah stand up to John, or would she choose to ignore the truth? Hours passed without a call. Beth paced the living room, her stomach twisting with anxiety. Tom sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, waiting for something. Anything. Finally, just after midnight, Beth's phone rang. She grabbed it instantly. "Sarah?" Sarah's voice was shaky. "Beth, I confronted John." Beth's breath hitched. "And?" There was a long pause. "He admitted it," Sarah whispered. "He's been using the money. He said it's for family expenses. But I looked at the bank records. It's not. He's been lying to me, to all of us." Beth's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Sarah." Sarah took a shuddering breath. "I told him I couldn't be part of this. I told him I want a separation." Beth's heart pounded. "Sarah, are you sure?" "Yes." Her voice was stronger now, steadier. "I want to do what's right for Jason. And I know now. Keeping him from Angela was never right." Beth wiped at her eyes. "What happens now?" Sarah exhaled. "I want to fight for full custody of Jason, without John." Beth blinked, stunned. "Sarah." "I know I can't undo what's happened," Sarah said, her voice breaking. "But I can make it right now. If you and Tom are still willing, I want to find a way for Jason and Angela to be together." Beth felt her knees go weak, the overwhelming relief washing over her in waves. "Of course we are." Sarah let out a soft, shaky laugh. "Then let's do this the right way." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Patricia helped Sarah file for separation, gathering evidence of John's financial misconduct. When confronted with the documentation, John had no choice but to step down from Jason's custody battle. In the end, he signed over his parental rights entirely, unwilling to face the public scandal of a lawsuit. The day the papers were finalized, Beth and Tom sat in the courthouse hallway with Angela, waiting for Sarah and Jason to arrive. When the doors opened and Jason came running toward Angela, the two children collided in an embrace so tight neither of them let go for a long time. Beth looked at Sarah, both women sharing a tearful smile. "They're finally together," Sarah whispered. Beth nodded, her heart full. "For good this time." Beth sat still, her fingers curled into the wood of the picnic table, her nails pressing into the rough surface as she watched John and Sarah Hughes walk away. The autumn wind rustled through the trees, scattering golden leaves around the playground where Angela and Jason played, oblivious to the deal that had just been struck. Beth could still hear the echo of John's voice in her ears, his cold, calculated demand for money in exchange for Jason. The words made her skin crawl. Tom let out a slow breath beside her, running a hand over his face before turning to her. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Beth blinked rapidly, forcing herself to focus on his face instead of the lingering disgust sitting heavy in her chest. "I don't know," she admitted. "I know we did the right thing. I know we had to agree. But it feels so wrong." Tom nodded, his jaw tightening. "Because it is wrong. No child should be treated like a bargaining chip." Beth swallowed against the lump in her throat. "But Jason will be with Angela. That's what matters." Tom squeezed her hand. "We'll make sure he's never used like this again." They sat in silence for a moment, watching Angela and Jason race each other toward the slide. Their laughter carried through the crisp air, innocent and free. Beth took a deep breath, trying to push aside the bitter aftertaste of their conversation with John. The important thing was that soon, Jason would be home where he belonged. Later that evening, after Angela had gone to bed, Beth and Tom sat across from Daniel Evans in his office, the papers from their agreement spread out across his desk. The investigator shook his head as he skimmed over the details, his expression unreadable. "So he actually named a price?" Daniel asked, his voice carefully neutral. Beth nodded. Without hesitation. Daniel exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "I've handled a lot of cases involving custody disputes, but this is something else." Tom crossed his arms. "We don't care about the inheritance. We just want Jason with us. But I hate that we had to play John's game to make it happen." Daniel tapped a pen against his desk, thinking. The good news is, legally, this should be straightforward. Since John is willingly giving up custody, there shouldn't be much resistance from a legal standpoint. The bad news is, if he was willing to sell Jason's future for money, there's no telling what else he's capable of. Beth shuddered. "You think he'll try something?" Daniel hesitated. "Not if Sarah follows through. She has legal standing to sign off on this adoption. But John, he strikes me as the type who doesn't like losing." Beth and Tom exchanged a worried glance. Daniel leaned forward. "We'll get everything finalized as quickly as possible. Once Jason is legally in your care, John won't be able to change his mind." Beth nodded, gripping Tom's hand tightly. "We just need to get through this last step." 2 weeks later, in a quiet courthouse, Beth and Tom stood with Angela beside them as the judge reviewed the final paperwork. Jason stood close to Sarah, his small hand gripping hers, but his eyes kept darting toward Beth and Tom, as if afraid this would all slip away at the last moment. John was noticeably absent. Beth wasn't surprised. The moment the inheritance paperwork had been drawn up, he had signed off on Jason without a second thought. Sarah, on the other hand, had stayed. Beth could see the sadness in her eyes as she knelt down to Jason's level, smoothing a hand over his dark hair. "You're going to be so happy with them," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Jason hesitated, glancing at Beth, then back at Sarah. "Will I still see you?" Sarah's lips trembled, but she nodded. "Of course, sweetheart. I love you so much." Jason threw his arms around her, burying his face in her shoulder. Sarah held him tightly, whispering something Beth couldn't hear. After a long moment, she pulled away, wiping her eyes. Then, with a deep breath, she turned to Beth. "Take care of him." Beth's throat felt tight as she nodded. "We will." The judge cleared his throat, drawing their attention back to the front of the room. "Are we ready to proceed?" Beth took Jason's hand. "Yes, we are." The final signatures were made. The judge stamped the last page of the adoption decree. And just like that, Jason was theirs. Angela beamed as she threw her arms around Jason, squeezing him tightly. Jason clung to her just as fiercely, his face buried in her shoulder. Tom rested a hand on Beth's back as she wiped away tears. "We did it," he whispered. Beth exhaled shakily, nodding. "They're together." Later that night, when they arrived home, Jason hesitated in the doorway. Beth watched as his eyes darted around the house, taking in the cozy living room, the soft lighting, the framed pictures on the wall. He looked up at Beth with cautious eyes. "This is really my home now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Beth knelt down beside him, brushing a gentle hand over his cheek. "Yes, sweetheart. This is your home. Forever." Jason bit his lip, glancing at Angela, who grinned at him before grabbing his hand and tugging him inside. "Come on, I'll show you your room." Jason let himself be pulled forward, his grip on her hand tight. Beth followed them up the stairs, her heart swelling as she listened to Angela's excited chatter. She watched as Jason stepped into his new bedroom, a space decorated just for him, with soft blue walls and a bookshelf filled with stories waiting to be read. A set of twin beds sat on opposite sides of the room, one for him and one for Angela, because Beth and Tom had known from the moment they decided to bring him home that the siblings wouldn't want to sleep apart. Jason stood still, his eyes wide as he took it all in. Then, slowly, he turned to Beth. "Can I really stay?" Beth swallowed past the lump in her throat and smiled. "Forever." Jason's small face broke into the brightest grin she had ever seen. He ran to the bed and flopped onto it, laughing as Angela did the same. They bounced together, giggling like they had no worries in the world. Beth leaned against the doorframe, her arms wrapped around herself as warmth filled every inch of her soul. Tom wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pressing a kiss to her temple. "They're happy," he murmured. Beth nodded. "They're home." That night, as Beth tucked them into bed, Angela curled up beneath her blanket with Bunny tucked under her arm. Jason lay beside her, his new stuffed bear clutched to his chest. Beth ran her fingers through his hair gently, just as she did with Angela, her heart aching with love. "Good night, sweetheart," she whispered. Jason blinked up at her sleepily. Then, in a voice filled with quiet certainty, he whispered back, "Good night, Mom." Beth's breath caught. Tears filled her eyes as she pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Good night, baby." As she stepped out of the room, Tom wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. She wiped at her tears and leaned into him, her heart full. They had fought for this moment. And now, their family was finally complete.